Hey guys, I hope you had a happy Easter and were able to hang out with your friends or families, even in these unconventional times. Today we're just going to be finishing up Chapter 13. It's kind of a lot of listing, cataloging, but I'll try to zip through the unimportant stuff as quickly as I can. As usual, here are the answers to the warm-up that you should have already done. All right, so the first half of it is on antisocial relations, then the second half on pro-social relations. So first half is going to be about things that distance us from other people or draw us away from other people, and then second half is all about the ways in which we come together as people. So starting off with prejudice, you just want to know that prejudice is a negative attitude towards a group. It doesn't have to be negative, but most of the time it is. And then the three components of prejudice: negative emotions. So even though the definition says it doesn't have to be negative, it does say that it has to include negative emotions, so basically always negative. Stereotypes is the second component, and then a predisposition to discriminate, and we'll talk about those last two real quick. A stereotype is a generalized belief about a group of people, whether or not it's accurate. So even if something is true, it is still a stereotype. So it doesn't depend on it being false necessarily, but oftentimes stereotypes are overgeneralized. And then discrimination is negative behavior towards a group and its members. So when we're talking about prejudice versus discrimination, prejudice is a negative attitude, but discrimination is negative behavior. So I can be prejudicial towards someone, I can have negative feelings about them, but unless I physically say or do something to harm them, that's not discrimination. Discrimination has got to be a behavior, but prejudice is just an attitude. And then microaggressions are less obvious, less severe forms of discrimination. A good example for this one would be if you walked onto a bus and there were only 2 seats available and one of them was next to a white person and one of them was next to a black person. We've done experiments like this where we have a full bus and we watch someone get on and see where they choose to sit, right? And so people who consistently would choose to sit next to the white person and not the black person, that would be a form of a microaggression. Microaggressions are usually like imperceptible to people except who they affect. So that black person who's now sitting, the only person on the bus with a seat open next to them, sitting alone, will probably pick up on what you've done, but the person you just sat down next to or anyone else on the bus probably wouldn't notice, which is what makes it kind of micro. Okay, and then implicit prejudice. So this is implicit, essentially just means unconscious. So prejudice that we maybe don't say out loud that we have, but that somewhere in our subconscious mind, it's still kind of lingering and it affects our behavior. So how do we study implicit prejudice? One way, the most popular way probably, is the implicit association test. And so I pulled up a little IAT online for you to look at. So an implicit association test tells you to sort 2 objects. And so as you can see here over on the left side, we're supposed to put any negative words, any bad words, and any people who are black in the same category, in the left category. And in the right category, we're supposed to put any positive words, good words, or any white people's faces. And then once you complete this round of association, then we switch good and bad. So you're supposed to associate good things or good words with black people and bad things or bad words with white people. And essentially what they're looking for is the time delay between your responses. Is it difficult for you to associate good things with black people, and was it really easy for you to associate bad things with black people, or vice versa for whites, right? So that's kind of how an IAT works. Next is considering unconscious patronization, so kind of like microaggressions. For example, a grader was told the essays they were grading were written by either a white or a black student, and the grader changed the harshness of their grading based on this knowledge. So when we gave different graders the same essays, but we told one grader that they were written by white people and the other grader they were written by black people, across the board, people who thought they were rating black students would rate them lower than white students but compared to other people, when they thought it was a white student, the exact same essay, they graded it much higher, right? Okay, and then monitoring reflexive bodily responses. So hooking people up to something like a polygraph that measures their physical arousal. And we look at things like facial muscle responses and activation of the amygdala. The most interesting thing to me is a study on microexpressions in prejudice. And so remember we talked about microexpressions being those little facial muscle twitches that happen when you feel an emotion. And so you've got your core emotions: joy, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, and disgust, right? And try to think about what kind of facial expression you might have if you feel prejudicial towards someone. If you're prejudiced towards a black person and their face shows up on the screen in front of you, what emotion are you going to feel? Joy, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, or disgust? A lot of people think it could be fear, could be anger, could be surprise, but I want you to write this down. Disgust reactions are linked to prejudice. Disgust reactions are most closely linked to prejudice. So it's actually a reaction of disgust that people have that often motivates prejudice and discrimination. So I think that's interesting. Okay, we're going to talk about some commonly targeted groups for prejudice. So racial and ethnic groups, of course. What we have seen is that blatant interracial prejudice, so people just outright being racist, has decreased over the years, but subtle or unconscious prejudice lingers. People with darker skin tones experience greater criticism and accusations of immoral behavior. We see that in the court system too. And in the IAT, the implicit association test, 9 in 10 white respondents took longer to identify pleasant words as good when presented with black-sounding names rather than white-sounding names. 9 out of 10 is a lot to be seeing a difference in an IAT. Gender groups. We see implicit and explicit prejudice and discrimination among the genders. In Western countries, we pay more to those men who care for our streets than to those who care for our children, women. Gender bias applies to beliefs about intelligence. Men and women score equally well on intelligence tests, but children tend to perceive their fathers as being more intelligent. So that suggests that we're sort of purporting the cultural idea that men are smarter than women. In many places, sons are valued much more highly than daughters. Moving on, we've got LGBTQ groups. In most of the world, gay and lesbian people cannot openly and comfortably disclose who they are or who they love because of laws that restrict that behavior in different countries. 39%, almost 40%, of LGBTQ Americans reported having been rejected by a friend or a family member because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. 58%, almost 60%, reported being subject to slurs or jokes. And 80% of LGBTQ adolescents reported sexual orientation-related harassment in the prior year. 80% experienced harassment for a characteristic of who they are. And I want you to write this point down right here. LGBTQ people are the most common targets for hate crimes. They're the most common targets for hate crimes. Lastly, belief systems or religious groups. Particularly, we saw a huge spike in belief systems prejudice after the 9/11 attacks and the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. 4 in 10 Americans acknowledged some feelings of prejudice against Muslims. So 4 in 10 were openly willing to admit that they were prejudiced, which can only lead you to wonder how many of them are prejudiced but just wouldn't admit it. About half of non-Muslims in Western Europe and U.S. perceived Muslims as violent as well. Okay, some more roots of prejudice. Social inequalities and divisions. So there's something called the just world phenomenon, and this is the idea that people believe the world is just and they get what they deserve and deserve what they get. And so this can lead you to make the fundamental attribution error. Let's think about it. If you think that the world is just, people get what they deserve and deserve what they get, then you must think that a homeless person is the cause of their homelessness, right? They aren't working hard enough. They don't care. They're not motivated. They just want to live off of government welfare or something like that, right? So they deserve what they got. They're homeless because they brought that upon themselves. And so they deserve to be homeless. See how you're making the fundamental attribution here. You're overestimating the person's character, their disposition, and underestimating the situation, the experiences they might have gone through that ended with them becoming homeless, right? I mean, it could have been anything. It could have been crash of a stock market, a parent died, a parent was laid off, right? There could be any reason that a person is homeless, right? But you can make the fundamental attribution error if you're following the just world phenomenon and believing that just karma essentially evens everything out and people deserve what they get and get what they deserve. Okay, next to in-group, I want you to write us, and next to out-group, write them. This like us versus them idea has been purported for a long time, but it's just the difference between in-group and out-group biases, and we'll talk about in-group and out-group bias a little bit later. But in-group is anyone who you personally identify with, the us, and out-group is them over there, the people that are not a part of your group. So an in-group bias is this favoring of your own group. An out-group bias would be sort of the opposite of that, not favoring the other group. For negative emotions, we've got scapegoat theory, the theory that prejudice offers an outlet for anger by providing someone to blame. For example, after the 9/11 attacks, people lashed out at innocent Arab Americans, who of course were innocent since they were alive, right? It was 9/11. And so this sort of stuff is an example of the scapegoat theory, that obviously these Arab Americans were not responsible for the 9/11 attacks, but we're going to still lash out at them and use them as a scapegoat, an outlet for our anger, and someone to blame. And then other evidence for the scapegoat theory, economically frustrated people tend to express heightened prejudice, and experiments to create temporary frustration intensify prejudice. So this is really kind of like catharsis. Remember, you just have to like get your anger out some way. When it comes to cognitive shortcuts, we tend to form categories and classify things in life in order to simplify the world around us. And so it's very basic sort of for a human being to look around and think, how is this person or this thing similar to me and how is it different from me? And race is one of those things, especially, that is so easily discernible, whereas sexuality maybe isn't, right? Just looking at someone, you can't necessarily tell if they're straight or gay. But in just looking at someone, you can absolutely tell if they're white or black, right? And so when we form these categories and we sort of create the in-group, us, and the out-group, them, that's how we can sort of fuel prejudice as well, and totally unintentionally, right? We perceive out-group homogeneity, and that is just the idea that other groups look the same to you. So like if I'm a white person, then all black people are going to look pretty similar to me. But if I'm a black person, then most white people are going to look basically alike to me. But I can tell the differences between the people of my own race. But when I look at other races, they look much more similar. So this also leads to really poor eyewitness identification in courtrooms if the eyewitness is of a different race than the person that they supposedly witnessed, because they're way more likely to make a false ID because they aren't able to distinguish sort of the minute characteristics between members of another race besides their own. The other race effect is sort of what we call that. That's the tendency to recall faces of your own race more accurately than faces of other races, because the faces of other races look homogeneous to us. And then remembering vivid cases. We tend to best remember emotionally impactful events that come to mind quickly. They influence our perceptions, can lead us to overestimate how frequently events occur, and beat our stereotypes. So this is really just the availability heuristic. And then victim blaming. People often justify their prejudices by blaming victims. Here's a good example of hindsight bias, also promoting victim blaming. So a story was told of a woman who was raped, and people came to think that she acted in certain ways that helped cause the rape to occur. But when a different group of people was told the exact same story, but it didn't end with a rape, no one believed she was inviting the sexual activity. So they read this story, and the independent variable would have been which ending the group received, an ending where no rape occurred or an ending where there was a rape that occurred. And so you tell the exact same story of how the woman and man behaved at the start of the date to the point at the end. And then you ask questions like, did you think that the woman was being provocative, or da-da-da-da, right? So what we saw was that when there was no rape at the end of the story, people answered all those questions saying, no, the woman wasn't behaving inappropriately at all. But when it did end with a rape, then all of a sudden people were saying, actually, maybe she was sort of inviting that activity and leading the guy on. Okay, so kind of some components to aggression. So when it comes to genetic influences, I think this is hilarious. The Y chromosome is linked to aggression. No way. Males are more aggressive than females. Characteristic difference. But yeah, so the Y chromosome is linked to aggression. But also, and this is probably more important, the monoamine oxidase gene. That breaks down serotonin and dopamine, and that affects aggression. When levels are low, aggression increases. Because if levels are low, we're not breaking down the serotonin and dopamine, so we're not getting those pleasurable calming effects. Instead, we're responding with aggression. Neural influences. Specific brain areas can inhibit or increase aggression when stimulated, specifically the amygdala. There you go. In fact, the activation of the amygdala increases aggression. Frontal lobes are also related to aggression. Violent criminals have decreased activity in their frontal lobes. So when frontal lobes are damaged, inactive, disconnected, or not fully mature, aggression is more likely. Remember that frontal lobes are responsible mostly for self-control, right? As far as also like judgment and planning, decision-making, stuff like that. But in this context, self-control is a really important one. People who have low self-control are going to be more aggressive, right? They can't push back those aggressive urges and hold them in. And then biochemical influences. Again, testosterone is linked with aggression. So I know that testosterone is in both males and females, like we talked about before. But males have more testosterone than females, right? So this is also kind of another men are more aggressive point. Alcohol also unleashes aggressive responses and affects aggression biologically and psychologically, right? And again, that's also related to that frontal lobe deactivation. Okay. So now we're asking, we just talked about dispositional factors, right? Things like within a person. Now we're going to talk about sort of situational factors, psychological and social cultural. So aversive events can increase or trigger aggressive behavior. This is known as the frustration aggression principle. The principle that frustration, when something frustrates us, it creates us to feel angry, and then we generate aggression as a response to that anger. And so here's some examples of that. Hot temperatures, physical pain, personal insults, foul odors, cigarette smoke, and crowding can all make us more prone to aggressive behavior. So we actually see a spike in violent crime every time the weather gets hotter. So that's one thing. We see just really any situation where someone feels unpleasant, even if it's not due to the action of the person. It could be some outside thing like the temperature or an odor in the air or something like that. Anything that frustrates us causes us to act out aggressively a lot of the time. Reinforcement and modeling. When aggression rewards us, we act aggressively again. So thinking about that from a parenting standpoint, let's say your kid is kicking and screaming and they want this candy bar in the grocery store, and you're not giving it to them, right? And then they hit you, and so you're like, oh my gosh, just quit it. This child is acting ridiculous. And so you just give them a candy bar, right? Well, you've just rewarded their aggressive behavior, right? You've taught them that when you act out aggressively, you get what you want. So that's what this is speaking to. When aggression rewards us, we act aggressively again. Aggression models from parents and others can influence our own aggression levels as well. So even if you weren't spanked yourself, even just like witnessing someone else being violent to their kid is like a model for that behavior that you can fall into that can affect your aggression as well. Aggression can be influenced by culture, right? So some countries are more aggressive in nature than other countries, and that's sort of just the cultural way. And then media models is the last one we're going to talk about. So we always kind of talk about whether or not video games create social scripts for violence. And so a social script is a culturally modeled guide for how to act in various situations. So let's say that a child who's never driven a car before because they're too young, someone who's 12, 13 maybe, is playing Grand Theft Auto, right? And so in their experience, when you drive around a car, you're supposed to be like crashing into things and stealing other people's vehicles and, whatever, right? That's a social script. It's this kind of guide for how to act in various situations, in the situation of, let's say, driving, right? And then so when you go out on the road and you actually learn to drive, you might feel tempted to speed, right? Because there are no speed limits in your game. Or you might feel tempted to assault and steal someone else's vehicle, right? That's kind of where the question lies, though, is how far can we implicate video games as being something that actually causes, violence in people. But the idea is that media that promotes violence or aggression can create a social script for it and can give people ideas of how to act poorly in other situations, and could encourage them to be violent, especially in other situations. And here's kind of some more summary on that point about video games. Video games can prime aggressive thoughts, decrease empathy, and increase aggression. People randomly assigned to play a violent video game became more hostile at a follow-up task. Studies of adolescents show that those who play the most violent video games become more aggressive and see the world as more hostile. However, there are better predictors of aggression than playing violent video games, and some of those are depression, family violence, and peer influence. Historical trends also actually indicate that the world is becoming less violent over time, although I would suggest that has something to do with sort of laws and cultural norms that develop over time. Okay, second half, pro-social relationships. So why is it that we befriend or fall in love with some people but not others? First factor is proximity. That's just your actual closeness and distance to someone, and that is your best predictor of friendship. So, makes sense, right? You're not really going to make friends with people that you can never see. And so we're most likely to make friends with people who live a close distance from us. And then the mere exposure effect is the phenomenon that when you are repeatedly exposed to the same stimuli over and over, you become more interested in it, or you like it more. So this is kind of one thing Dr. Lawrence would always say in class is the best way to get someone to become interested in you romantically is to figure out where they hang out most frequently and just show up. But you got to make it so it's not like you're stalking them, right? But through the mere exposure effect, the idea that if this person just sees your face over and over, even if they aren't consciously thinking, that's the same person I saw before, that's not what it comes down to. It has to do with just how many times your unconscious and conscious mind have been exposed to seeing a person's face, right? And so if you can show up in the same locale where your crush hangs out and they just bump into you by chance all the time, that can lead to an increased attraction or liking. modern matchmaking. We have online matchmaking now, which expands the pool of potential mates. Internet form relationships are on average slightly more likely to last and be satisfying. So maybe that's encouraging. Recent findings from speed dating events show that people who fear rejection often elicit rejection. So if you really feared rejection a lot, you sort of put off that energy and people rejected you in turn. So sort of fearing rejection, I think what it ultimately boils down to is an anxiety, right? And so if you have an anxious energy, or you're even doing small things with your body that show that you're anxious, it makes the other person start to feel sort of the same way. That's like mood contagion, right? If they feel anxious, they don't want to really see you again, right? Given more options, people make more superficial choices. So that's interesting. And men tend to wish for future contact with more of their speed dates. Women are more choosy. Physical attractiveness is the biggest first impression element of attraction. And physical attractiveness predicts how often people date and how popular they feel. But people's physical attractiveness is surprisingly unrelated to their self-esteem and happiness. We have not seen a correlation between physical attractiveness and self-esteem and happiness, which is, just so hard to comprehend, right? You'd think for sure there would be an association there. Strikingly attractive people, so like 10s, are sometimes suspicious that praise for their work can simply be a reaction to their looks, so they're a little bit cynical a lot of the time. For couples who were friends before they were lovers, looks matter less than shared values and interests do. And then symmetrical faces are the most attractive to people across the board. Lastly, we've got similarity. Friends and couples are far more likely than randomly paired people to have commonalities in their attitudes, beliefs, interest, age, religion, race, education, intelligence, smoking behavior, and economic status. So basically, people who are close are very similar. That's the main point. The more alike people are, the more their liking endures. So what that means is the more alike, the more similar people are, the longer their relationship tends to last, the longer they tend to keep liking each other. And then the reward theory of attraction says, we like those whose behavior is rewarding to us, including those who are able and willing to help us achieve our goals. So if someone comes in who is able to be rewarding to us in some way in our lives, that influences whether or not we are attracted to that person. Okay. So, passionate and companionate love. The first thing I want you to write down on your worksheet right now is compassionate love is not an option. Compassionate love is not an option. So frequently on this exam, Dr. Lawrence will describe either passionate or companionate love, and you'll have to select which type it is as the answer. And one of the answer choices is going to be compassionate love, which is not something we talk about in intro psych. It is actually a type of love in psychopersonal relationships, but you don't need to know it. It's not mentioned in this book. So that is the most common mistake that people make. One of them is choosing compassionate love when they mean companionate love. Companionate. So passionate love is essentially lust. This is just intense positive absorption in another person. It's like the honeymoon phase. It happens at the beginning. So it's lust, and it happens at the beginning of a romantic relationship. Whereas companionate love, you have become companions. So this is a deep affectionate attachment that we feel with people who their lives are intertwined with ours. And passionate love eventually will grow and turn into companionate love over time if the relationship is committed and lasting. So passionate love is like lust, and it happens at the beginning of a relationship. Companionate love is a deep, affectionate bond and attachment, and it develops later on in the relationship. So make sure you write that down. Compassionate love is not an option. Equity is a condition in which people receive from a relationship in proportion to what they give to it. And so I want to make a note here about equity versus equality. Equality would be, I do exactly half of every single chore in the house, and my husband does exactly half of every single chore in the house. I do half the laundry, half the dishes, I sweep half the house, right? And he does the other half. That would be equality. Things are absolutely equal between the people. Equity is where people feel that something is fair, even if it's not equal. So let's say instead I say I'm willing to sweep and vacuum and do the laundry if you'll do the dishes and clean the bathroom, right? We're both entering agreement that we feel is fair, and that's what makes it equitable, even though it is not technically equal. When equity exists in a relationship, it's a very strong predictor of longevity and relationship satisfaction. Longevity just means how long the relationship will last. So the more equity, the longer the relationship lasts, and the more equity, the more satisfied people are in the relationship as well. Self-disclosure is just revealing secrets, basically. So revealing intimate aspects of yourself to other people. You're disclosing information about yourself. Typically, when one partner engages in self-disclosure, the other will reciprocate, and then intimacy gets increased. Okay, we've got altruism, and this is just unselfish regard for the welfare of others. So just doing good things purely for the sake of them being good, right? Just to help other people. The bystander effect is the tendency for any given bystander to be less likely to give aid if other bystanders are present. So the most common example, and this will make more sense of that, is the case of Kitty Genovese. And so in your textbook, we talk about a woman named Kitty Genovese who was raped and murdered on the streets of New York. And there was like hundreds of witnesses from up in this apartment complex, all that could look down and see what was happening on the street. And even though when the police found her body the next day and interviewed all those people, hundreds of them said they had seen the assault below, every single one of them said, I didn't call the police because I figured someone else would. Because I thought someone else would. And not a single person called. And so this woman was assaulted and murdered on the street and left for dead, even though there was over 100 witnesses, because every single person thought, surely someone else will call, I don't need to. That's the bystander effect, that if other people are present, you're less likely to help. And that's because of the diffusion of responsibility. This is the idea that if other people are present, I'm not personally responsible for this. We all have the responsibility to do something, right? That responsibility is diffused among everybody here. And so if no one else is helping, I don't have to be the one to do it. Right? And that's what contributes to the bystander effect. But what might increase someone's odds of helping? What might make it more likely for someone to help instead of less likely? If the person appears to need and deserve help, the person is in some way similar to us. Remember that similarity breeds liking and increases empathy. The person is a woman. That's because we perceive women as weaker and in more need of help. We just observe someone else being helpful. That's observational learning. We're not in a hurry. If we are in a hurry, we definitely have the bystander effect and just assume someone else will help. I'm too busy, surely someone else will come along. If we are in a small town or a rural area, again, this is going to lower the bystander effect because less people are around to potentially help. So if you're in the opposite of this big city, now you're going to have more bystander effect. But small town or rural area, less bystander effect, therefore more likely for people to help. And then if we're feeling guilty, this is cognitive dissonance, right? If we feel guilty, we want to lower that guilt that we feel, so we feel like we have to do something good to make up for it. And then if we're focused on others and not preoccupied. Lastly, if we're in a good mood, that has to do with that feel good, do good phenomenon we talked about earlier in a previous session. Okay. Social exchange theory is just saying the social behavior we engage in with other people is all for the purpose of maximizing our benefits and minimizing our costs. So the things that our behaviors that we do in society or the way that we interact with other people has to do with us wanting to reap rewards and avoid punishments, right? Maximize benefits, minimize costs. And then the reciprocity norm is an expectation that people will help people who have helped them. So that you would reciprocate, right? Reciprocity, you would reciprocate kind behavior of others. If someone does something good for you, you will help them or do something good for them back rather than hurt them. And then the social responsibility norm is an expectation that people will help those who need their help, especially people like young children, the old, the disabled, right? So people who appear to need and deserve help, there's sort of an expectation in place that we're going to help those people, right? So underneath social exchange theory, I want you to write motivated by own interest. Motivated by your own interest. Social exchange theory. Motivated by your own interest. And then for reciprocity and social responsibility norm, I want you to write motivated by social expectation or by pity. Motivated by social expectation or by pity. Okay. So then a social trap is a situation where the two parties, if they're pursuing their own self-interest instead of the good of the group, end up becoming caught in a mutually destructive situation. So here's an example to sort of tease that out. We harm our collective well-being by pursuing our personal interests. So if you neglect to care for the environment because you feel that you are not really contributing much to the collective problem, right? But if everyone pitched in, the world would be a much better place. So when everyone sort of has the same mentality, oh, I'm just one person, I'm not, going to create that large of an effect, right? This creates a social trap because you're not thinking about the collective, you're only thinking about yourself. And if everybody has that same mentality, thinking about only themselves, well, now it does matter what you personally are doing because it matters what everyone collectively is doing. So that's a social trap, is you're pursuing your own individual interests, but it actually harms your interests long term or harms your interest in the collective. Mirror image perceptions. So this is really just the idea that however your in-group looks at another out-group is the same way that out-group looks at you. So the best example I have for this is Republicans and Democrats. So Republicans are going to look at Democrats as being unintelligent and disruptive, for example, right? But how do Democrats look at Republicans? As unintelligent and disruptive, right? So this is really that idea of just, it's like looking in a mirror, and whatever you think about the person on the other side, they think the same thing about you. What did I do? There we go. And then a self-fulfilling prophecy is a belief that leads to its own fulfillment. So in social psych, these are beliefs that influence your behavior and therefore then influence the behavior of another person in a way that confirms your beliefs. That sounds so complicated. Let's break it down. So my behavior affects another person, right? And it actually influences how they're going to behave. And sometimes those behaviors will come back to confirm what I thought about that person. So let's use an example because it'll make a lot more sense. I think that this one boy in class is rude, right? And so I don't want to talk to him. I don't want to have anything to do with him. Every time he walks by me, I look away because I don't want to deal with him. Anytime he raises his hand in class, I roll my eyes and sigh, something like that, right? So let's say he starts picking up on those behaviors. He starts noticing that I'm annoyed with him all the time. Well, now he's going to behave in such a way so as to avoid me, right? And the more that he does things to avoid me, the more rude I'm going to think he is. But it all stems from the fact that I thought he was rude to begin with, and I was behaving in such a way that it affected his behavior and made him act rudely towards me, right? So here's another example. Dr. Lawrence always talks about this one girl that she had in class who was a man-hater, and she just couldn't ever shut up about, oh, we all know men are this or that way, But so let's take the man-hater girl, for example. She'll probably never have a positive experience with a man because she's going to be rude and standoffish to men based on her beliefs about them. In return, they're not going to like her, and therefore they're not going to be kind to her, and so she'll experience confirmation bias that she's created for herself in a self-fulfilling prophecy. So again, all men are aggressive, rude, annoying, disrespectful, right? Standoffish. And so this girl always acts defensive towards men no matter what they're saying, right? And so they pick up on this. Now they're going to treat her rudely because she hates them, right? And now she's going to pick up on that rudeness and be like, see, I knew that men were this way. This just proves it, right? So that's the idea behind a self-fulfilling prophecy. Last section. Okay, what can we do to promote peace? The first thing is contact. So negative contact increases disliking, but positive contact, especially if it's non-competitive and it's between people who are of equal status, typically helps to promote peace between people. And that's partially because familiarity breeds liking, right? The mere exposure effect. So with cross-racial contact, South Africans' interracial attitudes have actually moved into closer alignment. Heterosexuals' attitudes towards gay people are influenced not only by what they know, but by who they know. And the most common reason for holding accepting attitudes towards LGBT people is if you have a close friend or family member who's part of that community. And then friendly contact, for example, between black and white roommates, improves attitudes towards others of the different race and even towards other racial groups. Cooperation. So a superordinate goal is a goal that overrides the differences among people and requires their cooperation. So a superordinate goal, when we say super, what that usually means is above. And so when we're talking about a goal that overrides differences, it is above differences. It is above anything that could make you upset with a person. It's a goal so big that you actually put aside your differences to work together. And so an example would be the wildfires in California, right? It doesn't matter what color the person living next to you was, both of you just lost your homes, right? And so your superordinate goal to seek support and to get through this disaster, right, overrides your differences between people. So like the California wildfires, like hurricane damage, anything like that, a superordinate goal. Right now, the coronavirus could be one. Conflict is reduced not just by mere contact, but by cooperative contact. So we have to get people not just to sit together and talk, but actually work together to do something. Shared predicaments can also have unifying effects. So like I just said, like with the wildfires or hurricane damage or something like that. Communication, a third-party mediator, like a counselor, volunteer, something, can facilitate much-needed communication, and mediators help each party voice its viewpoint and understand the other side's needs and goals. And then conciliation. So we've talked about grit in lowercase before, but there's also grit all in uppercase, and that stands for graduated and reciprocated initiatives in tension reduction. And this is just a strategy that's designed to decrease international tensions. Here's how it works. One side announces its recognition of mutual interests and its intent to reduce tensions. So one side comes forward and says, hey, we have something we can work together on, and so I want us to calm down and not fight anymore and instead work towards this common superordinate goal. Then one or more small conciliatory acts are then initiated. So something is given up. I will give you money to do this, or I will promise to sign some kind of nuclear agreement or something like this, right? You offer something. And then this opens the door for reciprocity for the other side to offer something back. And that's really the idea behind conciliation. So that's the end. I know that was just kind of a lot of summary, so congrats to you for getting through it. But make sure to submit the worksheet under assignments and to take the quiz on Canvas. And other than that, have a great week.